Welcome back! This week we'll focus on goals, the reason why your readers will want to invest their precious time in consuming your story. In storytelling, goals are provided by the needs of identifiable characters. So, what we need to learn is how to make your recipients adopt the goals imposed by your story. Your characters' goals are not always the story goals, but they tend to be. So, for simplicity, let us assume they are. In any case, if you think about it, adopting someone else's goals is pretty odd behavior. Why should we invest time and attention rooting for someone we just met? For unless you're writing about very well known, beloved people, your characters will always start as total strangers to your readers. We don't do that in real life. Moreover, why do we sometimes root for people we would never want to associate with in real life? Why, for instance, would anyone want to share an evening with a horrible, unlikable miser like Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol? This week, we'll talk about why it is necessary that readers embrace your story goals and how identification enhances transportation. We'll also talk about how we determine our affective dispositions toward story characters, and thus how it is that we decide whom we should be rooting for. Finally, we will talk about those characters we shouldn't like, but we still do, about our paradoxical attraction to morally ambiguous and morally repulsive characters. And to explain why we like these guys, we'll also talk about empathy, our reaction to the state of others. As we saw before, self-determination theory proposes that motivation grows when we satisfy our need for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. As story recipients, nonetheless, we have no control over story developments. Adopting somebody else's journey reduces our autonomy because we are led to follow a path chosen for us. That's why a story must be inherently enjoyable, so that we actively choose to engage and remain engaged with a story, whatever path it leads us through. As we remember from the first week, consuming a story is a goal-directed task that we embrace seeking entertainment, escapism, to learn something useful, or to find meaning, and with the further intention of changing our mood. This basic goal remains, regardless of our character's goals. We want to either repair a faulty mood or reach a better affective state. Entertaining content improves our mood by keeping us entertained, while meaningful content changes our mood by making us reflect on what's important. In the end, it's all about changing our affective state. We use stories as tools that will allow for affective change because we cannot choose to experience feelings at will. We cannot simply decide to feel sad or happy. We can only choose to involve ourselves in situations that hopefully will evoke the kind of emotional responses we are looking to experience. By itself, reading will not produce the emotional responses we are looking for. If that were the case, reading any text would do. It is the information that we extract from the text what we find rewarding. And for that information to be rewarding, it must provide a solution to an identifiable problem. Are we trying to figure out who committed a crime, whether Cinderella will marry the prince, whether Leela and Lenoo will escape poverty and the cruelty of the neighborhood, or whether Charlie and Jignesh will end up in prison? We need direction because only by finding direction we will be able to focus attention and appraise the significance of story events. Now, consider the way we play games. We play games to have fun. Having fun is and will remain our main goal. But to have fun, we need to know the game's objective. Having fun is dependent on trying to achieve that objective. In Donkey Kong, the main objective is to climb to the top and rescue the girl in the fuchsia dress. Learning the game's objective does not replace our main goal, that of having fun. It becomes a secondary goal that we need to achieve to start having fun. Once we know the game's objective, we embrace it and start working toward achieving that goal. Then, overcoming every obstacle that prevents us from attaining that goal becomes a new secondary goal. When playing video games, we follow a learned schema. We don't really care about the girl's fate. We adopt the goal of rescuing her because that's what you do when you play a game. You adopt whatever mission you are given. Her situation simply gives direction. Having direction helps us satisfy our main goal, that of having fun. If we perceive that playing the game stops being fun, we abandon the game. Sorry, girl in the fuchsia dress, it is just too boring or too difficult to rescue you. With a story, it is pretty much the same. To satisfy our primary goal, that of changing our mood, we need to understand what the story is about. What is the main character's dilemma? Here we also follow a schema. We start a story looking to learn what is at stake and what problem needs to be solved. Just like games, engaging stories include both the problem in the character's dilemma and the solution in the story's resolution. In a game, by controlling a character's actions, we impose our identity into that of the character. When the character fails or succeeds, it is us as players who fail or succeed. Actually, a game does not even need to have characters, anthropomorphic or other. We may be playing cards or controlling falling puzzle pieces like in Tetris or selecting rows like in Candy Crush Saga. The point is that we are the ones making the decisions. We remain bound to the game's rules and objectives, but the character becomes an extension of ourselves. In a story, we don't create a narrative by making decisions. Instead, we create a narrative following the cues of a storyteller. When successfully engaged, our emotional responses rely on assessing the story events not from our perspective, but from that of a character. Yet, we don't adopt a character's goals simply because that is what you have to do to enjoy a story. We truly need to care about the characters. The engaging experience will be enhanced when, in addition to caring for a character, we truly identify with them. When we not only feel for a character, but we come to feel as if we were that character. Identification is born from the fleeting sensation of replacing our identity with that of a story character. Let us start here. When we identify with a character, we become that character. The sensation may last for just a fraction of a second, but it occurs repeatedly while engaged with a story. As a consequence, we come to understand the character's motivations and appraise the story event's significance from the character's point of view rather than ours. Our emotional responses to the story correspond to how story events indicate progress or reversal of a character's goals. For instance, in the Iranian movie Children of Heaven, one of the main characters, Ali, participates in a race and accidentally wins first place. Winning first place would be normally a reason to rejoice, but it is a devastating event for Ali, and so it is for an engaged viewer, one who has embraced Ali's perspective. The race's third prize was a pair of new sneakers, which Ali and his sister desperately need. Ali has lost his sister Sarah's shoes, and now he has to share his shoes with her so that they can both attend school. Sarah wears them in the morning, Ali wears them in the afternoon. The race's first prize was a tracksuit, which they didn't need. Sure, we could rationalize it. Ali could sell the tracksuit or exchange it, but his pain becomes our pain because we know how badly he wanted those shoes. We don't dismiss his reaction as that of a dumb kid. We don't think, oh, it's only a pair of shoes. We understand his pain because we have identified with them. Cohen defines identification as an imaginary process that entails merging with the character and sharing the character's knowledge about the narrated events, adopting the character's goals, for instance, hoping that they succeed, and sharing the character's emotions. He proposes that identification can be operationalized in 4 dimensions. The first one is empathy, which Cohen defines as feeling as if we were the character, mirroring the character's experience rather than just feeling for the character. For instance, when we see a character fight, we may feel as if we were the ones giving or receiving the punches. It depends on whom we identify with. We can feel the hero's rage or his pain as he receives a hit. The second dimension of identification is sharing the character's perspective, coming to an understanding of the character's motivation for their behavior. These two concepts are closely related because empathy is more than feeling the same way a character does. Empathy is a dynamic process that goes from perceiving cues that suggest a character's affective state to feeling like that character through an internal simulation of that state, understanding how that character feels, and having an emotional response to that understanding. That response is about the character, but personal to ourselves as story recipients. Empathy, in its broadest sense, is an emotional reaction to the state of others. It is a subjective experience particular to every individual. As story recipients, our affective responses may correspond to the same affective responses experienced by a character, but not necessarily. First of all, because our response relies on perception. If we cannot infer the other's emotional state correctly, because the cues are not clear enough, we will not be able to match that response. Then, because the illusion of merging identities with a story character is fleeting. During identification, we subordinate our identity to that of a story character, but for just one moment, not throughout the whole process of consuming a story. The illusion of merging identities is soon replaced by a response that, rather than always matching the inferred affective state of a character, corresponds to how we interpret the events portrayed in the story, not only in relation to how we infer that the character feels, but also to the whole mental model we have created about the story, and even about ourselves when the story evokes personal memories. Damasio proposes that when transported by a narrative, the autobiographical self, defined in terms of biographical knowledge, the social me that we present to others, defined by our gender, age, profession, socioeconomic status, experiences, etc., retreats. The proto-self, however, the recipient of feelings, and the core self, the agent capable of action, which together form the material self, the self that feels and acts, always remains because consciousness relies on its presence. Even when deeply transported, the experience of a story recipient remains subjective. Hence, when we see Snow White receiving an apple from the witch, we see that she is grateful for the present, and we understand why, but we don't feel as fortunate as she does because we know more than she does. We know that the apple is poisoned. We understand how she feels as well as her perspective, but we don't feel the same way she feels. She feels grateful. We feel worried. We may even yell at the screen. Our emotional response is an empathic response congruent to the event, but it is not the same emotion experienced by Snow White because we possess information that she doesn't. Our perspective shifts from that of a spectator to that of a character, back to that of a spectator. And when the story evokes personal memories, the emotional responses may be very different across individuals. For instance, you may identify with the characters in these three movies and enjoy them regardless of your gender or ethnicity. Still, if you are Black, Mexican, or a woman, the emotional experience may be more intense and personal because you will also interpret the story from your particular perspective as a member of a specific social group. As Damasio remarks, the material me doesn't disappear. And if the story calls attention to the autobiographical self comes back. Remembering about ourselves may distract us briefly from the story, but it also makes it feel more real. The more we recognize the self in the story, the more we may identify with the story characters. Identification is enhanced by perceived similarity. Recognizing what we have in common with a character in regards to physical attributes, demographic variables, beliefs, personality, values, circumstances, etc. Perceived similarity is not a guarantee of identification, however. For instance, physically, I look a little like the actor that plays Marcello Solara. but I don't identify with them. Perceived similarity simply facilitates the process. We are more likely to identify with characters in similar circumstances to ours than with characters that simply look like us. Preston and DeVals developed a perception-action model of empathy following their observations of animal behavior. The model proposes that attending to the other's state translates to an internal motor representation that mimics that state. This simulation generates an affective response that is congruent but not necessarily equal to that of the other. The word congruent is key. Congruent doesn't mean identical, it means in agreement with or in harmony. Empathy, therefore, involves two levels. I call those two levels feeling empathy and having an empathic response for simplicity. Depending on the author, you will see different denominations. The important thing is that these constructs agree. The first level involves developing an understanding of the other's affective state, how it is that the other feels, born from an internal simulation of that state. This simulation comes from either motor mimicry, also called sensory empathy, or from cognitive empathy, also called theory of mind or perspective taking. Motor mimicry or sensory empathy is a tendency to imitate and synchronize our facial expressions, vocalizations, postures, and movements with those of another person. For instance, when we see people laughing, we may start laughing too, even if we don't understand why they laugh. Same when we see people yawning or with long faces. From this simulation of the other's bodily state, we understand how the other feels. It often leads to emotional contagion. Empathy born from motor mimicry is common among social animals. That's how your dog knows when you're sad. He unconsciously mimics your state, and from that simulation, he understands how you may be feeling. Your dog will not understand why you feel the way you feel. He only understands your current state. Cognitive empathy, theory of mind, or perspective taking is a representation of the internal mental state of another individual. It is also a simulation. This time, however, the simulation doesn't come from mimicking the other's bodily state, but from creating a mental model of a potential state, what we commonly call putting oneself in somebody else's shoes. For instance, when you read this famous one-sentence story, For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn, you may conclude that the baby died and feel sorry for the mother. You don't know how she feels, so you're not simulating her state based on direct evidence. You are inferring her state by inferring that the baby died. The story doesn't say that. And putting yourself in her circumstances. In this passage in Elena Ferrante's book, we come to understand how the protagonist, Lanu, felt while strolling by a rich area of Naples. I looked not at the boys, but at the girls, the women. They were absolutely different from us. They seemed to have breathed another air, to have eaten other food, to have dressed on some other planet, to have learned to walk on wisps of wind. We understand how Elena feels not from simulating her bodily state, which Ferrante doesn't state, but from creating a mental model of her state. We understand that she felt intimidated because we adopt Elena's perspective. Cognitive empathy demands a lot of complex thinking, so it is a rarer experience. So far, there's only evidence that great apes like humans or chimpanzees can put themselves in the shoes of others and create a theory of mind. Your dog may be able to tell when you're sad, and he may try to comfort you, but he cannot tell why you're sad because he cannot see things from your perspective. The second level of empathy, the empathic response, also called emotional or affective empathy, is our personal response to the understanding of the other's state. We first come to understand how the other may feel because we briefly simulate their experience. Then we have an emotional response based on the information that the simulation provides, but also on what we know about the situation and ourselves personally. When we see Snow White receiving the poisoned apple, we simulate a future state where she is dead, therefore, our concern. However, our empathic response may not necessarily be positive. It could be a negative response too. When consuming a story, our response is dependent on the direction of our affective disposition toward the story characters, that is, whether we like them or not. For instance, when we see that Indiana Jones punches a Nazi, we don't feel sorry for those Nazis. All the contrary, we may flinch at first. Ouch, that must hurt. But we end up celebrating it. Yeah, punch those Nazis. When Indiana Jones becomes the one getting punched, ouch, you flinch again. You don't celebrate it. You feel sorry for the poor guy. Both sympathy and antipathy are plausible empathic responses. They are emotional responses that result from understanding how the other feels and from assessing the situation as one favorable or unfavorable to the character we are rooting for. As Franz de Waal puts it, the typical definition of empathy, sensitivity to another's emotions, understanding another's situation, says nothing about being nice. Like intelligence or physical strength, empathy is a neutral capacity. It works like this. You see that someone gets punched, you either flinch due to motor mimicry and get to understand that being punched hurts, or if you don't get to see the punch, you imagine that what being punched feels like by putting yourself in the shoes of that who received the punch. That is, you understand that being punched hurts through cognitive empathy or perspective taking. Either route leads you to what I call feeling empathy, an understanding of the other's situation following a simulation of their possible affective state. Then you assess the significance of that situation. You are not assessing one event. You are not basing your judgment on a single punch. You are assessing the whole situation, what it means for you as a story recipient rooting for a central character, and therefore sharing that character's goals and perspective that the other was hit. Well, we hate Nazis. They are the bad guys. So yeah, hit them harder, Indiana. And we love Indiana Jones. So we feel sorry for him when he's the one who receives the punch. Our response to similar events is either sympathy or antipathy, depending on whom we're rooting for. Depending on their definition of empathy, some authors would say that when our response is antipathy, it is because we blocked empathy. It all depends on how you see it and whom you choose to focus your attention on. An antipathetic response is one in which we give more weight to our personal situation than to the situation of the other. We could stop and think, oh, that poor boy that Indiana Jones just hit probably has a mother. However, we have recognized the young man as a Nazi and therefore as an antagonist to Indiana Jones, and thus we fail to sympathize with him. That's why it is important to think of empathy as a two-step process, one in which we simulate the other's experience, what I call feeling empathy, in which we come to understand how the other feels, and one that comes from an assessment of the situation, after which we have an empathic response. In this example, I'm showing an empathic response in one dimension, antipathy or sympathy, depending on our affective disposition to the character in question. But your emotional response to the state of others can be anything as long as it is a congruent emotional response. If we see someone else laughing, for example, our empathic response may also be laughter. However, if we think that they are laughing at us, we may get angry or sad. It all depends on how we assess the situation. Our empathic responses are affected by the context and experience, not just by the perception of the other's state. As long as our emotional response is congruent to that of the other, it will remain an empathic response. Again, congruent doesn't mean identical, but in agreement with or in harmony. If you respond with sadness to people laughing at you because you infer that they are making fun of you, that is a congruent response to their emotional state, but also to the circumstances. Sympathy or compassion is a typical empathic response to witnessing others' distress, but not the only possible response. We feel compassion if we perceive the other's distress as undeserved. If we perceive that the distress is deserved, our empathic response may be antipathy. In both cases, our empathic responses would be congruent to the other's state because they are born from an understanding of how the other feels within the context. Nevertheless, when we respond with antipathy, we give a bigger weight to our perspective than to the perspective of the other. That's why we don't feel too bad when villains get punished. Our empathic response considers how the other feels and how that information makes us feel, knowing what we know about the character and the situation. In assessing how that information makes us feel, there may be a judgment of morality. Good, that all had was bad. She tried to kill Snow White. She deserved it. Now, if you respond with annoyance to someone's request for help, say an email asking for a donation, that may not be a congruent emotional response to the state of others. Perhaps you failed to perceive the magnitude of the other's distress, or maybe you just didn't read the whole email. Maybe you saw the contribute button and decided to delete it because you found the request a nuisance. Your annoyance, in this case, is not a congruent response to the state of the other because it is based on your personal feelings only, not on an assessment of how the other may have felt or their situation. You did not empathize with the other. If you actually perceive the other's state and understand their situation, but you just don't care, that's another story. Not caring about others' affective states is a symptom of psychopathy. Some people believe that psychopaths cannot empathize with others, but that's only half the truth. Psychopaths can perceive other people's emotional responses and so they can understand how others feel. That's why some psychopaths can be very manipulative. They just don't care about how the other feels. What characterizes those diagnosed with an antisocial personality disorder, the proper label to the condition, is a chronic and pervasive disposition to disregard and violate the rights of others. It is not that they fail to acknowledge those rights, it is that they just don't care about them. In any case, most people are not psychopaths. Actually, we all have some level of psychopathic traits. We all can be a little untruthful, manipulative, callous, impulsive, or unempathic. However, for most of us, it is not a problem. Most of us are not that bad. Consuming stories increases our ability to understand others' emotions and thus our ability to empathize with others. It is like being a doctor. With time, you learn how to recognize your patient's symptoms at one glance. The more stories you consume, the easier that it becomes to put yourself in the shoes of others and create empathic links with the story characters. Because most of us tend to sympathize with those in need or distress, your main concern should not be then whether your recipients will have a congruent emotional response to your character's affective state, but whether your recipients will understand your character's affective state. And for that, the solution is easy. Make your character's affective state or situation clear. In a film, that is easy to do with music, close-ups, and theatrical expressions. For instance, have you watched the video for On the Nature of Daylight by Max Richter? If you only see this picture, it is hard to tell how exactly the actress feels. The director went for realism. Without the music, it would be harder to empathize with her. However, if you watch the video and listen to the music, you get to understand exactly how she feels, even if you have no idea why she feels that way. The music reinforces the effect of her subtle facial expressions. I will put a link to the video on Canvas so that you can see it. Now, how do we get to do the same with text? You cannot put music to a novel. Well, we just say it. Here, Ferrante tells us how Elena and Enzo felt after Enzo hit Lila with a stone. Enzo threw a stone that hit Lila in the head. While I was shrieking in fear, and Lila got up with the blood dripping from under her hair, Enzo, who was also bleeding, climbed down the embankment, and seeing Lila in that state, he utterly, unpredictably, and to our eyes incomprehensibly began to cry. Now, we don't know how Lila felt. We know that Lila is bleeding, but how did she respond? Did she start crying too? We could imagine her response since we know how brave and stoic Lila is. She probably refused to acknowledge the pain, but did she? Pages later, we learn that Lila went around proudly for a while, with her head bandaged. The proudly tells us what we needed to know. Sure, unnecessary adverbs would make our work sloppy, and sure, the right verb could sometimes do the work, but adverbs exist for a reason. We should not be afraid of using them when they do their work. A few pages later, in another episode at school, Ferrante clarifies how the events made both Lila and Elena feel. The clarification is necessary because we are used to thinking of Lila as strong and impervious to others' words. Here, we understand how vulnerable Lila feels through the empathic response of Lenou. It is a meta-empathic response. I felt her suffering. I couldn't bear the trembling of her lower lip and nearly burst into tears. Note that Ferrante is both showing and telling. The I felt her suffering is perhaps redundant, but it doesn't ruin the flow of the story, it adds to it. This is how Jane Eyre begins. Before we learn any particular details about the main character, we get to know exactly how she feels. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight, with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the chidings of Bessie, the nurse, and humbled by the consciousness of my physical inferiority to Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. Do not assume that your readers will carefully scrutinize the text and infer a character's state from the situation. Remember, smart brains are extremely lazy. Given the two routes from feeling empathy, mimicking the other's bodily state or putting ourselves in the other's place after considering their situation, the first one, motor mimicry, is the easier to follow. Of course, readers cannot infer how a character feels from seeing that character's facial expression as they would in a movie, but they can be told how that character feels. Thus, let me insist on this. If you want to maximize the chances that your readers empathize with a character, make that character's affective state clear. In my novel, to understand Charlie's poor decisions, you need to understand how he feels. He's afraid of Jignesh, but he also feels sorry for him. Making your character's affective state clear is extremely important for identification because that's how empathy works. If we cannot understand how the other feels, we cannot have a congruent emotional response, and for that understanding to occur, it is necessary to perceive the other's state first. If your recipients cannot understand how your characters feel, it won't matter how beautiful your prose is or how exciting your characters' adventures may be. They won't be able to identify. I'm also sharing on Canvas a scene from Batman Returns, which I really like. If you haven't watched that movie, I highly recommend it. The dialogue is bad and the plot is unrealistic, but Michelle Pfeiffer's performance is amazing, and it is amazing because she goes through a wide range of emotional expressions that we can clearly perceive, understand, and feel realistic despite the unrealistic plot. Do her responses make sense? Not very much. Yet, they enhance transportation because they are so clear that it is difficult not to empathize. So let's add that to our cheat sheet. Identification relies on empathy, which relies on perception, which relies on clarity. If we cannot understand a character's affective state and their situation, we won't be able to identify with that character. The third dimension in which Cohen operationalizes identification is the degree to which we internalize a character's goals. The fourth is our degree of absorption, how transported we are by the story, which relies not only on empathy but on story development. Internalizing the character's goals means embracing them fully as if they were your own. That depends on finding those goals relatable. For instance, in My Brilliant Friend, we read that Elena and Lila buy Little Women, and that after reading and rereading it many times, they decide to write a book and become rich. That is an easy goal to embrace for us, isn't it? We like the girls, so we want them to succeed and to escape poverty. Then, at a personal level, we are also planning to write a book. The desire to become a successful writer is an easy goal to internalize for us because it not only aligns with our affective disposition toward the characters, but also with our personal aspirations. In my novel, Jignesh's desperation to avoid getting caught is a goal easy to internalize too. Nobody wants to be punished, even if we know that we are guilty. Catching a prince may be a cliche, but it is also an easy goal to internalize as well, because we all want to find love, and we all want to climb upward on the social ladder. Now, do you remember this scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark? When we see the bad guys' melting faces, we may empathize and feel their pain too. We shudder in horror because we come to understand what they're going through. You may want to touch your face just to check that it is still there. You identify a little, and this time your empathic response may be more sympathy than antipathy because it is a horrible way to die. However, we haven't internalized their goals because even if we understand what the bad guys want, get the arc, we don't agree with that goal. The advantage of operationalizing identification in 4 dimensions is that we can figure out what to do to increase it. To make your readers feel more like the character, you have to make your character's affective state clear. Appeal to motor mimicry. To make your readers share your character's perspective, you have to make your character's situation clear. What is it that your characters need or want? Appeal to perspective taking or theory of mind. To make your readers internalize your character's goals, those goals need to be relatable or easily reducible to universal needs or drives. Finally, to make your story more absorbing, you have to make the plot more compelling by introducing conflict, which is a matter for another class. These 4 dimensions co-vary together. They are not independent. The more you feel like the character, the more you will understand the character. The more you understand the character, the more you will internalize their goals, and the more likely you will engage with the story, etc. The relationship is bidirectional too. You may not share a character's goals, but you may be highly engaged in the story, so you pay more attention. Identification may rise from that extra attention. Now, in addition to the 4 dimensions central to identification that Cohen proposes, I would add a fifth one, our affective dispositions toward the story character. We tend to identify only with those we care about. Enjoyment of a story is therefore dependent on the direction of our affective dispositions toward the story characters, on whether we care enough about those characters and their problems to devote time following them. But let's take a break here. Assignment time. Think about your experience reading the novel you chose and focus on the main characters. Post a short reflection of what your identification with the 2 characters meant to you. Whom do you identify with the most and why? If you couldn't identify with any of the characters, also explain why or comment on your favorite book. The idea here is that you reflect on what made you feel for a specific characters. Then, if you chose to read My Brilliant Friend, answer the short identification questionnaire that comes after this video. Finally, work on the first 10 pages of your manuscript. Highlight those words that state or clearly suggest an affective state. If your manuscript doesn't end up looking full of patches, you may have a problem. What can you do to solve it? No need to post anything, just do the exercise and start making corrections. Do your assignments, and I will see you in the next video. Later!